with a spike in prices we haven't seen since The Muppet Show came off the air. That's right. We're throwing it back to 1981, getting into these costs, why your paycheck's not catching up, but why there's also some signs we may have hit the inflation peak. Maybe. That's not so much of a relief right now to people, some of whom are getting priced out of their homes, right? In tonight's original, we're going to introduce you to some folks out in L.A. fighting back against these rent hikes. And elsewhere in the show, police are charging an Ohio man with raping a 10-year-old girl who reportedly had to leave the state to get an abortion. What we're now learning just this afternoon about that case as Democrats put reproductive health center stage at the Capitol today. Plus, we're live on the ground with the Dateline you don't see often, Sri Lanka, on a political and economic crisis that has forced the president there to leave the country altogether, protesters storming his home. Why people don't have a lot of trust in the country's government right now. And with Brittany Griner back in court tomorrow in Russia, we've got an NBC News exclusive from a woman who tells us what exactly it's like to be in a Russian jail and her advice to the WNBA superstar. That's later on in the show. Hey, I'm Hallie, and we're starting off tonight with a context check, okay, to get a better sense of why it is the costs are going up so much, why they feel so much worse, and what this means going forward. So let's start with the big number, 9.1. That is the fastest rise year over year since the best-selling car in this country was an Oldsmobile. They literally don't make them anymore. Okay, so to see what that looks like at the grocery store, let's do a meal together. It's like 88 degrees in D.C. right now. Let's do a little pretend barbecue. Let's make some lemonades. You want lemons? That cost is up almost a quarter. You want burgers, both ground beef and cheese? That'll cost you 2/4 more than it used to. If you want a bag of chips with that, 3/4. Add some white meat. Chicken breasts are up $1.22. That's the biggest bump ever in a year, by the way. Listen, we're talking cents here, but when it's everything, that adds up. And it's not just groceries. Rent is up, too, the most since 1986. Just, again, highlighting just how much more it costs for the stuff that you need to get by. And it means some people are cutting back on what exactly they're buying. Watch.
I'm starting to work more on a budget, more than I used to. So it's kind of hurting the wallet.
I'm not buying any goodies or any extras or anything like that.
No treats for him, huh? It feels like a lot more right now. Why? Because your paycheck is not going fast enough to keep pace. Even though what economists call real wages are up 5%, when you adjust this for inflation, you're actually making less than you were last year. Now President Biden saying, look, this is not acceptable. This is too high, and inflation is his top priority. But he's also saying that big overall number, 9.1%, the one we started talking about a couple minutes ago, he says that's totally out of date, given that gas prices are what's driving that bump. And listen, there is a silver lining here. Gas prices have actually been going down. They've been going down every day for the past month. Look there. Yeah, they're still $1.50 more than last year, but they're down 50 cents from last month. This is a drop that is not factored into today's report. But it's also not really factoring into the concerns some experts have right now. One senior analyst is telling our NBC News team that one of every two economists, half of economists, expect a recession. That's compared to just 1 in 3 a couple of months ago. Our business analyst for NBC News is joining us now, Stephanie Rule. And Stephanie, I'm glad to have you with us because our pal Charlie Herman talked with a different top expert who summed up today's report in one word: awful. Okay, but there are signs here that inflation may have peaked. Explain that.
All right, Hallie, here's the bad news. For about 80% of what you just said, I was not able to hear, but I'm going to guess that you asked me, what is behind this? Why are we facing this inflation? Yes?
Close enough, girl.
Okay, here we go. Listen, we have been in this inflationary environment for months. We were hoping things were going to taper off. Unfortunately, they haven't. What are the problems? They're the same problems we have had for months. We've got supply chain issues that are still related to COVID. Because of the war with Ukraine, we have seen a huge amount of pressure on oil and gas and food. This has made it really difficult to buy everyday items. The hope is that things are going to taper off. You're going to hear from the White House today saying, well, this is a bad number. Don't look at it. They are wrong in saying that, but it is a slightly dated number. It's from last month, and you just said it. Gas prices are slowly coming down, but as far as what is it like to live day in and day out, it's expensive. And for people who are focused on housing, who are focused on rent, it's really tough. The good news is it's a very tight labor market. Employers are out there hiring, and they're paying up. So while we are able to get paid more money, you can't have a payday party when everything you're buying costs more, and that's where we are.
It's also, you look at this nugget that's out today that I know is in a lot of group chats, that the dollar and the euro, right, are now at the same price for the first time in a couple decades. It's not just here, but it doesn't mean that's like amazing news for the health of the economy right now.
Okay, it also means that you're on really nerdy group chats, if that's what your group chat is talking about. It means
people who love to travel, girl. People who love to get over to Europe.
Okay, well, guess what?
Not just my group
travel. For people who love to travel, who are planning on going to Europe this summer, well, it just got a little bit cheaper. And now that the euro and the dollar are basically the same, you don't have to do too much of a money conversion calculator. So that's a net positive. But what it tells us, what it reminds us is, inflation is global. The same pressures we are seeing here, they're seeing overseas. And in fact, it's worse there because Europe is more energy dependent on Russia than we are. And it's sort of this reminder that even though the neighborhood doesn't look good right now, the United States is still the best house on the block. And it doesn't make you feel better when you're going to buy something at the store that it's also expensive in Europe. But it's good to know that the problem isn't unique to the U.S.
So look ahead to the Fed meeting 2 weeks from today. Interest rates will probably go up, right? That is the full expectation from experts. But is today's inflation report going to change how much?
Listen, today's inflation report, I was looking ahead. I was using my crystal ball. Today's inflation report confirms that we're going to get a rate hike from the Fed. The number one priority for the Fed is to tamp down inflation. They like it when inflation is around 2%. And you said it a moment ago, it's around 9%. This is a big problem. So they are most likely going to raise rates. And you said it, that could tip us into recession if they do too much too quickly. But guess what? They've got to do something, and this is their only tool.
Steph Rule, good to have you on. Good to have that breakdown. Thank you. We're going to talk more about rising rents, by the way, a little bit later on in the show. But we want to get to some breaking news on a story that has caught global attention because of what it says about what life in America is like now that the Supreme Court has overturned Roe versus Wade. NBC News has court documents showing that a 27-year-old is confessing to raping a 10-year-old girl who reportedly had to travel to get an abortion in Indiana, not in her home state of Ohio, because of the state's new ban on the procedure after 6 weeks. Gerson Fuentes is under arrest, according to these documents, and being charged with the rape of a child under the age of 13. Ohio's Republican Attorney General saying, "My heart aches for the pain suffered by this young child," thanking the Columbus Police Department. This is the same Attorney General who seemed to cast doubt on this story just earlier this week. Remember, President Biden had brought up this 10-year-old girl's story when he signed an executive order protecting abortion access. Isa Gutierrez is following the story for us. Isa, what else are we finding out today from this late-breaking news about these charging documents in this case?
Hey, Hallie. So with these documents, we're really able to build a timeline. It starts on May 12th, allegedly. That's what the complaint says, that the alleged rape occurred on or around that date. And then on June 22nd, there was a report filed with the Columbus police alleging that this 10-year-old child had been raped. Then on July 6th, the victim refers to Fuentes specifically as the suspect who raped her. And then just yesterday, 2 detectives from Columbus Police found Fuentes, served him with a warrant for a DNA swab. They performed that and then took him back to police headquarters where, and this is the key information that we're learning today, Fuentes confessed to police, according to these documents obtained by NBC News, that he did in fact rape this 10-year-old child. We're also learning from these documents that Fuentes actually appeared in court in Columbus today. His bond was set for $2 million. This bond being set against the state's advisement to the court. They filed a motion earlier this morning for him to be placed without bond or bail. They cited the fact that he is not a U.S. citizen, concerns that he could be deported, and concerns for the safety of the 10-year-old victim. His preliminary hearing, Hallie, is set right now for July 22nd, next week.
What has made this story, Issa, what has made this story such a national story is this local news report that initially talked about how this little girl had reportedly had to travel out of state to obtain an abortion after this alleged rape. And that is something that President Biden cited in this fiery speech, blasting the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe, making it harder for women, or in this case girls, to access abortion. We talked about that Ohio Attorney General who just this week seemed skeptical that the story even happened in the first place. And now here there is this significant movement in this story, which is this report of an arrest as confirmed by these police documents. This is something that had been talked about, I think, and pointed to on the conservative side of the aisle. And for that matter, the liberal side of the aisle, too, is a case that highlighted abortion access in this country.
Yeah, absolutely, Hallie. And what we're seeing today from these folks who really question the veracity of this story is a complete 180, right? I mean, you mentioned Yost really turning around on this, and he had spoken to many publications, not just Fox, recently saying, quote, every day that goes by, the more likely this is a fabrication. We saw publications, release reports about this. The Washington Post with a headline, a one-source story about a 10-year-old and an abortion goes viral. The Wall Street Journal editorial page posting an article that referred to this story as a fanciful tale. Not just in the last hour, them posting a new note with this new information about Fuentes being arrested. So again, just a complete change in tone here now that we have this new information. I also have to mention the other Ohio politicians, Republican politicians, who we'd been hearing from on this in the last couple of weeks, or not been hearing from, right? Governor DeWine being criticized for not coming out, speaking out more strongly on this and not answering more questions on it. And then, of course, Congressman Jim Jordan in a tweet originally saying, another lie, anyone surprised, retweeting an article with Yost's comments. Now, today, just in the last few hours, tweeting, quote, this man should be prosecuted, referring to Fuentes, to the fullest extent of the law. So we're expecting in the next, hours and couple of days to see a lot more of this. People really turning back on this now that we have this new information, Hallie.
Of course. And then, of course, the local news report about the travel that this alleged victim had to go through. Isa Gutierrez, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Democrats right now is reproductive health is in the spotlight, or putting their spotlight on that over on the Hill here in Washington, with hearings in the House and Senate on what the country does now after that Supreme Court decision. The Senate is putting health care providers front and center, but also highlighting how far apart Democrats and Republicans are, as you will not be surprised to hear on this issue.
I'm committed to continue to work across the aisle to provide these services and to improve our maternal mortality rates. Indeed, abortion is not the solution.
You can't spin away, ripping away someone's rights, taking control over their body, denying someone medication, or taking away their plans for their future.
Julie Sirkin is on Capitol Hill for us. And Julie, Senator Marshall brings up the idea of wanting to improve the maternal mortality rate. This is something one of the witnesses talked about for a bit, specifically on the inequities for black women. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, look, when you look at the Supreme Court decision on Roe, it affects every woman in this country. But when you peel that back, you really start to get into some of these racial disparities that occur when a decision like Roe was, of course, overturned, and there aren't these protections, especially in some of these red states. Now, both senators across the aisle on this committee wanted to hear more about this, because especially when you look at black women and reproductive access with racial disparities especially, they are 3 times more likely to die during childbirth than white women. That's according to the CDC. But take a listen to Dr. Jamila Taylor, who was a witness in today's Senate hearing, both across the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, asking her exactly about this.
It is always unconscionable to force the continuation of an unwanted pregnancy, but for black women and other populations who have been historically marginalized, it is particularly immoral and dangerous.
And look, Taylor highlighting the fact that these women, especially women who live in these states who have to travel hundreds of miles, don't always have the means to do so, and it's them who will suffer the most, of course, after this decision from the Supreme Court.
Julie, real quick, the concrete actions, because right now you've got Democrats in many places around the country saying, what is Congress going to actually do, right? Putting most of the blame on Republicans, but to shore up abortion rights. So what's going to actually come out of these hearings, right? Like, toss aside the talking points and the this and the that and everything else. Like, where does this practically, in a practical matter, go?
Look, we asked Senator Tim Kaine that this morning. Why him? Because he's actually working with the bipartisan group to try and see if they can get something to codify Roe protections into law. And he said flat out, I'm going to be honest with you, it's not likely. We don't have the votes. But one thing he did mention was, look, 2 months ago, gun legislation would have been a complete pipe dream. So maybe it'll get bad enough in these red states to where Republicans then have to act. But in the meantime, they're looking for the election. Democrats are pushing for the ballot box and hoping that their voters are not discouraged.
Julie Sirkin on Capitol Hill. Julie, thank you. Appreciate it. President Biden making the rounds today in Israel, arriving overseas to try to show support for that country, but also for a 2-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict right after landing.
We'll discuss my continued support, even though I know it's not in the near term a two-state solution. That remains, in my view, the best way to ensure the future of equal measure of freedom, prosperity, and democracy for Israelis and Palestinians alike.
The day was starting with this welcome on the tarmac from both current and former prime ministers of Israel, including Benjamin Netanyahu. And we're going to talk about that moment in a second. Before he got here, the White House had said the president would be taking some extra COVID precautions. So, like, no, that's why he's fist bumping, right? He's going to fist bump. Don't shake hands. That's a COVID-y thing. So he did that off the plane. But like a couple minutes later, Benjamin Netanyahu, he goes and shakes his hand there. Why does this matter? See, there's the handshake. So you're like, well, okay, fine, Hallie, optics, I get it. This is beyond optics, right? Because keep in mind that when President Biden heads to the next thornier part of his trip to Saudi Arabia, he's going to come face-to-face with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS there, somebody whom the U.S. has blamed for the brutal killing of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, a host of human rights issues there. Let me bring in Kelly O'Donnell, who's joining us now. And Kelly, I think this moment, these optics speak to the political minefield that President Biden has to navigate while he's in the region.
And optics are important because they do send larger messages. So imagine for a moment if a leader of another country came to the U.S. and was at the White House, for example, and did not shake hands with the U.S. president, how that would be perceived. So it's a big deal when you go, the American president goes abroad, to do things that fit within the customs and show respect to those that he encounters. And so this handshake moment is something that has been anticipated because of the controversial nature of meeting with MBS and the king, and that moment that could, in a photo, and certainly for those who are detractors of the president, critics of the president, it gives them a way to talk about some of the controversy here. So optics do have more meaning than just the passing photo moment. So that's why this is significant. And certainly talking about COVID for this president is something we've been all living with over the 18 months he's been in office. He takes more precautions than the average person and even other leaders because of the nature of his age, the office, and all of that. So we'll give them that COVID precautions are a piece of this, but also avoiding the handshake moment without offending is critical. Hallie?
Kelly, you know how much I love buckets. Let me take the second bucket, another bucket that has come to light during the president's trip overseas here, and that's an interview that he did today that I think is airing tonight where you are in Israel. I want to play a bit of it, and I want folks to listen to this sort of very newsy Iran moment. Let me play it.
In the past said you'll do anything, and you say it again, that you'll ensure Iran would not acquire nuclear weapons. Does that also mean, sir, that you would use force against Iran? Is that what that means? If needed?
That was the last resort, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So force against Iran if it were the last resort. Iran obviously still a key player in the region here, sort of the shadow over some of these meetings here for President Biden.
Very much so, and an enormous issue when it comes to the U.S.-Israel relationship because, of course, Israel feels an existential threat from Iran and has viewed the U.S. being involved in a deal to stop the nuclear weapons program as somehow appeasing Iran. So Israel doesn't support that deal. That's the one President Trump got out of, and President Biden has been trying to restart, to delay, forestall Iran making nuclear weapons. So his answer there is something that plays very loudly in Israel at a time when he's in the country trying to work on the relationship, which is already friendly, but trying to keep things in a place where he is showing support for Israel and putting pressure on Iran. Because Iran, of course, is a real foe for the U.S. And as we know right now, the administration is also talking about the fact Iran may be ready to provide Russia with some additional military equipment in its fight against Ukraine. And so Iran takes on big proportions. And so for the president to say he would not rule out using force is certainly notable. It's not a change in U.S. policy, but hearing him say it carries different impact. Hallie?
Kelly O'Donnell, great breakdown live for us from Jerusalem. Thanks, Cal. We'll see you tomorrow, I'm sure. Appreciate it. Today, you've got Secretary of State Tony Blinken telling Russia to stop, in his words, filtration operations. If you're like, wait a second, what does that mean? Is that water filtration? No, it's something far worse. It means the forced deportation of Ukrainians into Russia. That's what they call it. Basically, when Russia forces people to get out and go into Russia. Secretary Blinken says the Kremlin has deported between 900,000 to maybe 1 million Ukrainians from Ukraine to these isolated places in the far east of Russia. He says there are reports Russia's actually separating Ukrainian kids from their parents. even abducting, taking kids from orphanages in Ukraine and putting them up for adoption in Russia. It comes as today. Family and friends of another U.S. citizen, Suedi Merakezi, fear that he's being captured in Russia. That's what they're worried about. His brother says he called him last week, and he's being held in a Donetsk jail. This is according to the Guardian outlet. NBC News has not independently confirmed this. The State Department tells us they are aware of these unconfirmed reports. They say due to privacy considerations, they have no further comment. Let me bring in Hallie Arouzi, who's joining us now. And Hallie, let me start with these new U.S. findings today that are just, you know, the horrors of war in another dimension here. Adults and kids being forced into Russia, some of them from orphanages. What else do we know about this?
Hey, Hallie, that's right. The number of Ukrainians passing through Russian filtration camps continues to grow. President Zelensky says that it's actually up to 2 million. And the stories emerging from them, these people that have got out, are just absolutely horrendous, Hallie. We had the chance to speak to this 16-year-old boy who was released last week from one of these filtration camps and a prison, and his story is really quite harrowing. He was telling us that he was taken at a Russian checkpoint while trying to leave the Zaporizhia region, and the Russians then went through his phone. They threatened to kill him at the checkpoint, and then he was taken to a Russian jail. And the stories that he was telling there were just really distressing. He was taken to do cleaning duties in that jail. He was told that he has to clean up a torture chamber. He said he was mopping up blood from the floors. He was sharing a cell with other people that were having needles put under their fingernails while the Russians were trying to extract information from them. Now, he was lucky enough that his father was a politician, so he wasn't beaten up in those jails because they wanted to use him as a pawn to exchange somewhere later down the line, and that's exactly what happened. He was let out of the jail last week, but those emotional scars are going to live with him for life. I mean, he was 16 years old. He looked a lot younger than that, and I mean, he was pale and looked really terrible, and he never smiled once through the interview. So obviously a really terrible experience.
How about this American living in Ukraine for the last few years, reportedly now being held by Russia?
That's right. He's the third American that we know of that's being held by separatists. His brother says that he'd been living in Russia for the last in Ukraine for the last 4 years. He moved to the Kherson region in 2020, and he was taken about a month ago by the Russians. His brother said he spoke to him on the phone on the 7th of July and said he's being kept in the Donetsk region. And interestingly, his brother says he's in the same jail as Alex Durecki and Andy Wynn, those two fighters. But his brother says that he's not a fighter, that he'd come to Ukraine to work in the cryptocurrency market, and he'd been falsely arrested by the Russians because they said he'd taken part in anti-Russian protests. And his brother is obviously very concerned about his well-being. They haven't heard from him since, given what's happened to other people that have been arrested. It is very worrying. The State Department say that they are aware of the reports that he's been taken, but because of privacy reasons, they're not going to comment further, obviously warning other Americans not to come to Ukraine.
Hallie Arouzi, live for us in Kyiv. Hallie, thank you. Let's bring it back here to the U.S. because within just the last couple of hours, we found out more from officials in Texas, specifically in Uvalde, who announced they're working on a back-to-school plan with more security and more grief counselors for kids in that district. They also want to delay the school year altogether to give everybody more time to deal with that horrific Robb Elementary School mass shooting that stole the lives of 19 students and 2 hero teachers, 19 little kids and 2 teachers. The plan comes as victims of the shooting, their families, their loved ones, survivors. We're here in the nation's capital. That's what you're looking at. Folks here in Washington at a rally to try to ban assault rifles. One child, a survivor of the attack at Robb Elementary, and his grandmother spoke with NBC News. Watch.
I was in the Robb School shootout and Miss Garcia and Miss Mideast. I felt sad because most of my friends passed away.
We're here to ban firearm weapons now. We want actions now, not later. We don't want any other families to go through the same thing we've been going through.
You hear that frustration. That is exacerbated by what you're seeing on your screen right now. That surveillance video we showed you is developing news, breaking news here on the program last night. Officers waiting in a hallway as the shooter was firing off multiple rounds inside the classroom. Officers can be seen, for example, checking phones, reaching for hand sanitizer in one instance. I just spoke with Texas State Senator Roland Gutierrez. Listen to what he told me about this.
It's almost made for TV in some instances. It tells some of the story, not all of it. But 48, 50, 77 minutes in total of just police doing nothing, not doing what they were supposed to do under the active shooter protocol. While children died, while children bled out, it's disturbing.
I want to bring in Antonia Hilton now, who is live in Uvalde. Antonia, tell me what it's like and what you're hearing from people on the ground there, given some of these significant new developments.
Well, Hallie, on the side of the families, people here are hurting, they're outraged, and it's a mix of emotions because on the one hand, for 7 weeks, they've been fighting for transparency, for the surveillance video to be available for them to finally watch. On the other hand, they thought that they were going to see this on a meeting that was set for Sunday morning. And so its release last night came as a gut punch to many. They were frantically calling friends and family saying, don't go on Twitter right now, don't turn on your TV, this is incredibly disturbing. People described being unable to watch more than just a couple seconds of this video because, as you showed and described, the gunman coming in unobstructed by any law enforcement, over an hour going by. At one point, an officer looking at his cell phone. Another point, an officer reaching to wash his hands with hand sanitizer. I mean, the anger here and the amount of people who just brought up those moments in the videos, it's really astounding. Then on the side of law enforcement, a lot of that anger is turned toward the media. So they're more frustrated with the reporters who released this surveillance video than they are with the officers, it seems, who are in the video itself. They called the reporters from the Statesman and from KVUE chicken and unprofessional for releasing this before they wanted to get it out to the families first, Hallie.
You talk with a local pastor who's lived in Uvalde for years. Tell us more about that conversation, too.
Yeah, we spoke just a little while ago, and he has been meeting with families here. He has lived here for years and knows this small community really intimately. And so he's been having sort of private counseling sessions with people. And, he talked about that sort of tug of war right now between people's emotions, their sort of friendship and also sort of anxieties about the media, the way in which the media has helped them get their concerns and their desires out there, but also the way in which it's been hard for them to see what is really ultimately the last couple minutes of some of these children's, two beloved teachers' lives. To go online, to turn on a TV and to see that has been so hard for people here today. But then also this anger, and a desire to see more accountability from the officers there, but also from city officials who they think just still haven't given them the answers that they deserve. Take a listen to some of our conversation. You think they're trying to protect themselves?
That's why I asked the mayor last night, what's the cover-up, Mr. Mayor? What's the cover-up? Why did he say, if I talk, I go to jail? What are they covering up? That they didn't do nothing? Well, everybody knows that. 19 innocent children, 19 crosses with the two teachers.
And NBC News has reached out to law enforcement agencies for a response, for comment. But over the last several weeks, they've consistently been defending themselves. Chief Arredondo, who's been at the center of all of this, saying that he fought through different sets of keys to get into the classroom. Officials describing officers as heroes that day who directly put their lives on the line. When you look at this footage, though, and you talk to community members here, that is not what they see. They see police officers who they consistently right now are describing as cowards. They want to see many of them resign, and they feel that even though we're at the 7-week mark now, since a gunman killed those 21 people, that not enough has been done for all these families, Hallie.
Antonia Hilton, live for us in Uvalde. Antonia, thanks for being there on the ground for us. Appreciate it. Coming up here on the show, the writer behind a hugely popular book that's now being made into a movie out this weekend, reportedly wanted for questioning in a deadly shooting. We've got that in the 5 things. Plus, the conservative group that says it's expanding on college and high school campuses and raking in millions of dollars. We're getting into that with our Brandy Zadrozny, who just dropped a new piece. Coming up. To some NBC News exclusive reporting now on a young conservative group raking in some major bank, $55 million just last year, more than it made the year before. Talking Points USA is what we're talking about. TPUSA. It's one of the most active political organizations in the country, raising a lot more money than many other conservative groups during the pandemic. with some people suggesting that perhaps TPUSA is poised to maybe, if not take over the Republican Party, become more and more of a force inside it. It started as a grassroots recruitment tool in 2012, leaning more into culture war issues like critical race theory, LGBTQ rights, COVID vaccinations. It was founded by the guy you see on your screen, Charlie Kirk, who has since created some pretty strong ties with former President Donald Trump. It's now becoming so popular, the group says it has a presence on more than 3,000 college and high school campuses. I want to bring in Brandy Zadrozny, our reporter who covers misinformation and extremism. And Brandy, I commend folks to this piece on NBCnews.com, and I thought your tweet about this really summed it up. You say TPUSA spent the pandemic flouting public health guidelines, sowing distrust in the election, and leading into culture war issues. What did it get them? A boatload of money.
It's true. It really, really did. You know, I requested these tax filings from Turning Point USA. These are public documents. And I did that a few weeks ago, thinking that there would probably be an uptick in revenue, right? I don't think I was quite prepared for the amount of the increase, because we've been watching other big conservative groups too, right? Like the Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, and they've been reporting losses or stagnancy. And part of that is because they stopped touring, they stopped in-person fundraising during the pandemic, and Turning Point USA did not. So their tactics are really working. Like you said, they have this really embracing of Donald Trump. So even after Donald Trump is no longer in power, he's no longer the president, but they've continued to sort of get a benefit from that relationship. And it's expanded off college campuses, right? And it's brought these culture war issues into the mainstream. So there's a reason that the people I talk to say that we're all talking about diversity, so-called CRT, LGBTQ issues, this denial of trans people's existence. These were all Turning Point USA's really, that this was these are their pet projects, and now it's in the mainstream, and that's just what they wanted.
Well, talk about bigger scale, right? Because what you're alluding to is the fact that TPUSA is going to like flex its muscles inside the GOP. They're even going into younger grades now, middle schools, et cetera. I mean, they're trying to get a lock, it feels, on the next generation, of course, on the conservative party.
Yeah, I mean, having a college conservative group isn't new, right? You have the Young America's Foundation. You have other groups that have always been interested in college campuses. And the point always was to create the next generation of conservatives. Turning Point USA just did a really good job. And part of that is because it's helmed by this guy, Charlie Kirk, as you saw, who made $400,000 from Turning Points USA. That was his salary last year. So this new guy, he was 18 when he formed Turning Points USA, came on the scene, and all of these old money donors were just enamored with this young firecracker, and he started to raise money, and he's just continued to do so. In terms of, you know, their expansion and what's on their plate next for the takeover of the Republican Party, they're doing this really interesting thing in Arizona and in other states, and it's having Turning Point USA members become Republican precinct committee members. And these are sort of the lowest level GOP representatives. And that's the idea behind what one Republican said was going to be the full takeover of the Republican Party. Whether that's hyperbolic, whether they will actually come to pass, who knows? But they've been really good at their goals so far.
Brandy Zadrozny with that reporting. Always good to see you, Brandy. Thank you for that. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, Amber Heard, she's back in the news because a judge has rejected her push to try to get a new trial and set aside Johnny Depp's $10 million win. Earlier this month, remember, Heard asked the court to have a mistrial declared. Her lawyer saying there was even a mix-up with one of the jurors. A judge rejected that and said Heard cannot prove that the juror in question was prejudiced, so that previous essential victory for Depp in court will stand. Number 2, a new CDC report says superbug infections went way up in 2020. We're talking about dangerous drug resistance, like infections from bacteria and fungus, right? Wiped out a ton of progress made against them before the pandemic because of those cases up in hospitals now. Number 3, Starbucks says it's shutting down 16 stores because of safety concerns. Safety concerns from who? The company says employees. They're reporting threats to staff. They're reporting drug use. Workers will be given the opportunity to transfer to other locations. Number 4, the author of Where the Crawdads Sing reportedly wanted for questioning in connection with an alleged decades-old murder in Zambia. Officials there reportedly want to talk with Delia Owens, her ex-husband, and his son in the death of an alleged poacher. Owens told The Atlantic in 2010, her family had nothing to do with the killing. NBC News has contacted Zambia's embassy in Washington for comment. Keep in mind this book that a ton of you have probably read is being made into a movie out this weekend. Number 5, a Love is Blind contestant is suing the Netflix show, accusing it of keeping food, water, and sleep out of the hands of cast members. This person alleges that, in their words, inhumane working conditions were used to elicit irrational behavior for entertainment. So basically, hungry, tired people made for better TV. That's the allegation. They also say the cast was paid below minimum wage. NBC News has reached out to the production company and to Netflix for comment. When we come back, a state of emergency in Sri Lanka. The president's gone. He's out of the country. We're breaking down what's going on there with a reporter on the ground. Stay with us. You've probably seen Sri Lanka in the headlines and all over social media a ton lately, right? Have you seen the alerts on your phone? There's a ton of stuff going on there, pretty intense, because right now there's a state of emergency with Sri Lanka running into big political, economic problems after their president pieced out of the country, left right before he was supposed to resign. After that, you had protesters who, by the way, stormed his official house over the weekend, turning their anger and frustration onto the prime minister. Look at this. Dozens of people inside his office. You had some people standing on the terrace waving the country's flag. They want the prime minister, who is now the acting president, out, too. But he says he's not going to do that until there's a new government in place. This is a messy, messy situation over there. Sri Lanka's been dealing with a lot. There are countries in bankruptcy. You've got daily things that you need, food, medicine, not easily found. And political corruption has created so much mistrust in the government, obviously, right? Fidel Fernando is in Sri Lanka, in Colombo. He's an author and journalist. Fidel, I'm so glad you're with us tonight. Thank you. I know you're inside because it's the wee hours of the morning where you are. Talk about how serious this is. Talk about what it's like living there at this moment for Sri Lankans.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Hallie. It's absolutely harrowing here right now. The economic crisis is hitting absolutely everyone. Today, you mentioned the shortages and the price of food. Basics for Sri Lanka, things like rice, dal, just basic vegetables. Meat is out of reach for many people right now because food prices are soared. Just this morning, just walking around my neighborhood, there was an older lady there, burst into tears because she was given some money for groceries, and she was saying that they've got 5 people at home, barely eaten over the last couple of days. People are skipping meals. Some parents are skipping entire days worth of meals so they can feed their kids. On top of which, there's fuel shortage, which is, there are fuel queues all around the country that are taking over entire neighborhoods. Just, vehicles that are just sitting inert on the side of the road waiting for fuel coming to the petrol sheds. So transportation right now is a huge challenge for everybody. Schools are closed because of that. So education is being affected. Medicines are in a huge shortage as well. So elective surgeries are being postponed or rescheduled. Hospital staff are unable to get fuel shortage. Everything's kind of spiraled into this political crisis that we're seeing, which is the big repudiation of the form. Well, now Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was president until yesterday, until he fled to the Maldives, and then also a repudiation of Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, who, as you mentioned, is now the acting president.
So what is the solve for some kind of stability back here, Fidel? Like, what needs to happen to get Sri Lankans in a better place? And what is the onus on the international community and on, let's say, I know the State Department here in the U.S., which has to be watching what's happening here?
Yeah, on the economic front, there is an ongoing negotiation. There was an ongoing negotiation with the IMF until this weekend, when all of this political instability, or this kind of storming of the president's house and the presidential secretariat. And today, the footage we're seeing is from the storming of the prime minister's residence, where, I was there, watching all of that happen, prime minister's office, sorry. And with all of this political kind of instability and difficulties going on, the IMF, I think, have stalled their negotiations. And Sri Lanka desperately needs the IMF to come through for a good medium-term or even a short-term solution to the economic woes. In terms of political stability, that has to begin with the current acting president and the president in exile, essentially, both stepping down. Those have been the demands of these nationwide huge protests over the last 3 months. This last weekend and the last few days saw the kind of most spirited iteration of that. There is still, I believe, a protest going on outside Parliament this evening. 3 a.m., there are Occupy movements all over various cities, and they're all calling for Ranil Wickremesinghe, the acting president, and Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who still hasn't handed in an official permanent resignation letter, for both of those figures to step down to allow an interim government to take over and then solve the political crisis, because both of those figures have lost complete legitimacy. People do not trust them to negotiate with the IMF.
Fidel, just real quick before I let you go, are you safe? Is your family safe? Are you in an okay position right now?
Yeah, the thing with these protests is that they're largely peaceful. The worst thing that's happening to most people is the economic crisis. It's not, the thing about these protests over the last several months is that the state has been the instigator of violence throughout them. Today we saw tear gas come into the crowds outside the VM's office. But when the crowd stormed the office, it wasn't angry crowd. It wasn't looting, or in fact there were people playing songs just a few minutes or maybe half an hour after the storming of that office had taken place. So the greatest threats is if you're in a protest and the armed forces of security are taking aim at you. Physically, everybody's okay, but economically, it's hitting everybody in the stomach.
Fidel Fernando, thank you so much for being with us from Sri Lanka, getting up early or staying up late for us. I really appreciate it. Still to come, back here at home, dozens of people reported missing in Virginia after flash flooding. What we're hearing from that neck of the woods coming up next in The Local. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our Southeast Bureau, 40 people in Virginia have been reported missing after terrible floods swept through a county out west in that state. Look at this. The water was so powerful it actually pushed homes off their foundations. You had cars and trucks. Did you see that shot a minute ago? Piled on top of each other. Officials said so far there have been no deaths, but they do expect the number of people unaccounted for to go down, with rescuers still out there looking for them. From our West Coast Bureau, police in Southern California are still looking to somebody linked to 2 deadly shootings and a number of robberies at 7-Elevens. It all happened early Monday at 7-Eleven stores in 3 cities. The company asked other stores in the area to close the rest of the day and said it was focused on employee and customer safety. From our New York Bureau today, popular New York beach was shut down again. Why? Because of a shark attack happened on Long Island. Officials say a surfer ended up with a 4-inch gash on his leg when he was bitten by what he thinks is a sand tiger shark. No word on his condition, but keep in mind another surfer got bitten by a shark there earlier this month. We want to bring you tonight's original now with in-depth reporting on a topic we've been keeping an eye on. You know, we started this show with what? Inflation, right? Costs going up for a whole bunch of things, from gas to groceries to the dentist visits you might do. It's bananas, and rent is not an exception to that. Those rents all across the country, they're going up. Something like 30% in Cincinnati and Seattle, by 50% in Austin. And you know who that's particularly tough for? People living on fixed incomes. People like maybe your parents or your grandparents, seniors. A group of renters in LA, including some of those seniors, are now fighting back after a pretty unique set of circumstances priced them out of their homes. NBC's George Solis explains.
Home to nearly 30,000. Los Angeles' Chinatown is a gateway to the past, but not immune to present-day pressures like a higher cost of living.
I have the rent increases for over the years, starting this one, 2004.
At first, the rise in rent was modest, like the apartment Alejandro Gutierrez has called home for the last 26 years.
2007, 835, and so on. 2008, 883.
Still nominal increases.
Yeah.
Then, in 2021, a bill for $2,450 appeared, more than double the $1,160 he'd been paying.
I couldn't believe that.
He's not alone. Bonded over fears of eviction, fellow residents of Hillside Villa apartments have in some cases seen their rent more than tripled, blindsided by the end of a 30-year agreement between the city and landlord that kept rents affordable.
¿Cuál es el temor? What's the fear now that this price increase is happening?
that we cannot afford to pay this rent. I cannot afford to pay that market rate. None of us here in this building cannot afford to pay those rent increases. That's why we started fighting back.
A much larger housing war is brewing, especially for many seniors on fixed incomes. Rents up as much as 15 to 50% across the country.
Senior renters are more likely to be cost burdened.
Jun Zhu with the Urban Institute says the nation's current housing policy is not equipped to meet the incoming demand, and that more than half of these households threatened by skyrocketing rent will be non-white.
The bottom line is that we do not have enough supply of the affordable rental units for the seniors.
Right now, 1 in 5 renter households who qualify for housing help receive it. Waitlists are also long, and the paperwork can be challenging. In the next 20 years, some estimates say there'll be another 5.5 million senior renters in the U.S. With cost of rent soaring nationwide, some tenants fear how they'll be able to afford the future. In May, the Los Angeles City Council voted unanimously to buy the building from the landlord and has discussed using eminent domain to seize it, a government power that has largely been reserved to force residents out to make room for new development. Trinidad Louise, organizer with the LA Tenants Union, says the case could set a precedent.
This is the first time in the history of LA, in its 150 years or so, that eminent domain has been used to save affordable housing and to keep tenants housed.
While the landlord declined to speak to NBC News, in a letter to the LA City Council, his attorney argues the purchase or seizure of the 124-unit building is not needed, saying the majority of the households already have Section 8 vouchers to help subsidize their rent. Adding, the other 37 residents are almost certainly eligible and should be provided vouchers, arguing that buying a building for the private benefit of a very few would be grossly wasteful. But residents like Adela Cortez remain hopeful the landlord strikes a deal with the city.
Adela says if they end up getting evicted, she's going to lose everything. She's taking care of her grandkids, but it's not just that, her community is here.
A community that is living in fear they could lose their home, or in their words, their family.
We are familia. We help each other. So we don't want to lose that.
George is joining us now live. George, I'm so glad you brought us that reporting. You're there at the building. How soon could the city take over, and what else are people there doing while they're kind of in this limbo to see what happens?
Yeah, Hallie, good to be with you. And right now, the city and the landlord are still hopefully trying to work out some deal to keep rents affordable for all residents. Now, if that fails, well, then the property will need to be reappraised, and then a new offer will have to be put forth to the landlord. And if that fails, well, then that could trigger that lengthy and precedent-setting case of eminent domain. As for the residents, well, right now they're on a rent strike to really hammer home that point, that they are effectively being priced out. Hallie?
George Solis live for us on that story. George, thank you. Appreciate it. Coming up, Kate Snow joining us with an NBC News exclusive. Her one-on-one with an American citizen freed from a Russian prison on her story and her thoughts on Brittany Griner's case. Talking for the first time. We'll be right back. Tomorrow, WNBA superstar Brittany Griner will be back in a Moscow court after having pled guilty to drug charges last week, as more and more pressure is on the Biden administration to bring her back home. Now, we're hearing from LeBron James. He said on his talk show, Griner probably feels like America doesn't really have her back. And let's be real, right? There's not many people who know what Griner might be going through right now, except maybe Nama Isacher, who was detained by Russian authorities back in 2019. In an exclusive interview only with NBC News, she talked for the first time about what that was like, telling our Kate Snow about what her experience was getting arrested and charged in Russia. Listen.
It's a bit terrifying because they don't tell you anything, right? So I find it insane that I was detained for almost a full day without knowing that I was detained, without actually being told you are under arrest.
Isacher made what was supposed to be a 3-hour stop in Moscow while traveling from India to Israel. That 3 hours turned into 10 months she was stuck there because Russian officials say they found about 1/3 of an ounce of cannabis in her bag. They charged her with drug possession and trafficking. She was sentenced to 7.5 years in a Russian penal colony. Kate Snow is joining us now. And Kate, you know, this is so interesting because she's never spoken to the media about her story. And I wonder how much the timing of this, looking at what Brittany Griner is going through overseas in a Russian prison, has compelled her to talk now.
Yeah, it's absolutely that. I asked her that question. I said, you know, are you speaking out now out of camaraderie, out of support for Brittany Griner? She said, absolutely. The minute she heard about what had happened to Brittany Griner, she started following the case. She thought, I'm finally going to have to talk. She's very private, Hallie. She didn't really want to do interviews. When she got out of Russian prison back in 2020, 2 years ago, she was pardoned by Putin. She was a celebrity in Israel. The paparazzi was following her, and she didn't like that. She didn't want the attention. She was having trouble emotionally settling back into normal life with all the things that she had been missing for all those 10 months. So for her to speak out now is kind of a big deal for her, and it's because she wants to show support, and she wants Brittany Griner to maybe hear that you can get through this.
So tell us more about what she told you about her experience.
Yeah, so she was just under 10 months, Hallie, in various different institutions, in prisons, in jails. She describes generally very regimented system where you're up at a certain time, you go to bed at a certain time, you're in a cell with about 40 other women, she said. You only get to go outside once a day. In the place where we believe Brittany Griner is now, she was there, and she said to us that it was, you go out into like an open air cell, but it's got 4 walls, it just has an open ceiling, so you can look up and see the sky, but that's it. You're not walking outside at all. So she said it wasn't inhumane. She was able to read books. You know, she was able to learn Russian. She taught herself Russian so she could make friends with her fellow cellmates, but it was rough, and she kept a journal to try to keep herself going and keep herself positive, Hallie.
It's incredible to hear about. You know, you mentioned that Putin pardoned her. Russian President Vladimir Putin actually pardoned her in 2020, so she came home. And I wonder, you know, with Brittany Griner, there's so many other factors that are complicating this here. Brittany Griner is famous, you know, like famous in the U.S. for being a superstar. There's a war happening right now that Putin is trying to perpetrate in Ukraine. There are some complicating factors here that didn't exist. But talk about what happened in Isaac's case.
Yes, although there were some complications then, too. There was a famous prisoner in Israel who was Russian, that there was thought that maybe they would trade and do a prisoner swap. So there was a lot of behind-the-scenes machinations that she doesn't even understand. All she knows is her mother met with Putin, her mother in Israel, met with Putin when he was on a trip to Israel, and the next week, she got this pardon for humanitarian reasons. So she said, I hope something like this happens for Brittany Griner. Hallie.
Kate Snow, I'm so glad you're with us with this story, previewing it for us. I know we're going to have more on NBC Nightly News. I can't wait to watch. Kate, thank you. And again, you can catch more of Kate's exclusive interview coming up with Lester Holt, 6:30 Eastern on your local NBC station. That does it for us here on our NBC News streaming channel. We're going to have a lot more for you here tomorrow. Same time, same place. Thanks for being with us. More coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.